Do you think when people opt for... We often have Chris Dorr on the programme, I'm sure you're familiar with Chris, and others who work in that field. Do you get into defence law because you want to fight for the little man? That seems to be the kind of archetypal or the stereotypical belief that we all have.
Yeah, I think there is always that belief that as a defence lawyer, you're playing a part in the system.
Yeah.
And a lot of people ask you, well, how do you possibly defend someone who you know to be guilty? And the answer to that is, well, we're part of the same process. We're part of ensuring that justice is done and that justice is seen to be done.
Yeah.
And even the most appalling criminal deserves a defence. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. Unless you want the untrammelled power to be passed to the state to prosecute in any way they like, then there will always be defence lawyers.
Yeah, and you're right. When you sit in on a court case, and I always say to people, you know, there's still many people who don't even realise you can go into a court and sit. But I encourage people to do it because it's a rather beautiful thing. And I told this story many, many times when I first journalistically went into a courtroom and, you know, watched a prosecutor stand up and make a case of why this man was guilty. It was a murder case as it happened. I thought, well, there's no point in the defence man coming because this is clearly banged to rights, this guy. This is incredible. You know, there's no way. How on earth is anybody in dispute? The jury have just heard it. That's it. It's job done. Judge, you know, pronounce your sentence. And then we all broke for lunch, came back, and the defence stood up, and I thought, oh, hang on. And that's that point, isn't it? That's absolutely the point of law. Hang on a second. This is a whole different version of events from the one I just heard.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people who do jury service experience the same sensation.
Yeah.
That they think there is only one version of events. Yeah. And in fact, once you forensically examine the facts, a different version of events can come to the fore. Yeah. Perhaps we could do with a little bit more of that in public debate. A slightly more, you know, clinical and forensic approach to our arguments might be a welcome thing.
Indeed. It was the same case where the judge said something fabulous, and he just reminded the jury that science was a version of events as well, because of course you can be blinded by the science. You know, once a professor stands up there in the witness box and starts, you know, coming up with all manner of you know, snazzy interpretations of things, you think, well, he's a scientist, you know, he knows his stuff. And the judge reminded the jury that, you know, he might be right, but it's a version of events.
Absolutely. I think there are lots of problems with our system, but actually I do think we have one of the best in the world. If you look at the advocacy that takes place in our courtrooms and compare it to, say, the United States, ours is a controlled clinical forum, and I would encourage people to go to their local Crown Court because you can walk into any room, see any trial you want, and I think you'll get a good impression of what happens there. Yeah,
absolutely right. Let's have a look at what is happening at the moment. We'll have to tread a little carefully around this because there's been an arrest and there's been a questioning of a man, but I mean, this is what social media was designed for, frankly, isn't it? Because, you know, you put a video on there, everybody has an opinion, everybody has the conch on this, and you know, we use this phrase confirmation bias, but that's kind of what's happening here, because depending on where somebody sits, either down racial lines, down gender lines, down whatever line you want to look at, it's that they will project onto that video exactly what they want to see, maybe.
I grew up round the corner from Peckham in South London, and it's always been a very diverse place where communities of different ethnicities have rubbed along together. What I think is tragic about this story is that identity politics is now playing the role that racism used to in dividing the working class against each other. You know, it was always in the interests of white capitalists to divide their workers along racial lines, to say that white workers have nothing in common with black workers, nothing in common with Asian workers, that everyone had irreconcilable interests, that they were all competing over the same small pie. You're right, we have to be very careful about what we say about Peckham, but I think we can and will continue to see that what's happened there is that a working class community has been divided along racial lines again, and not this time thanks to racism, but thanks to identity politics. I think it's utterly toxic.
It's terrible. We've got, you know, people chanting, "You touch one, you touch all." Other people saying, "Keep your hands off black women." And it's the word black and the word women there, of course, that is arguably contentious, because that suggests that was somehow connected to a motivation. And that's what, firstly, we don't know that. We don't know anything about the nuance or what happened before they started filming this. But, you know, whatever happened to discussing this regardless of someone's colour or someone's gender?
Absolutely. And what is also unconscionable are the way that interest groups are now intervening. So you've seen the Runnymede Trust already come out and say that they are appalled by what's happened in Peckham and that they will always fight against violence against black women.
Yeah.
Of course, they don't mention Asian shopkeepers, they don't mention other members of ethnic minority groups. And no matter what your view on this, the rush to judgment and the rush to racialise is utterly toxic and can only do harm to working class communities.
It's incredibly disturbing, and you're right, Luke, on that point of working class community. This is a shopkeeper. It's it's a reasonable looking shop. I bet you that guy doesn't earn six-figured salaries, because you can't make that kind of money out of retail very easily owning a single shop. And I'm pretty sure he's also on the receiving end of a lot of shoplifting, probably on an hourly basis, because he's got that kind of store that sells cosmetics. Young people go into these places, and one or two of them don't like to pay. I'm sure he has that a lot. Again, I'm not judging what happened in this particular case, but this is an Asian man and it's a black woman, and somehow we've got a division there now between those two communities, and some people in the street were quite willing to pronounce that division quite overtly in what they were saying and what they had written on placards.
Well, I saw one image of a picture that had been assigned to the shutters of the shop, which called the owners parasitic merchants. Yeah. That is echoing some extremely dark times in our history. And we need to be extremely guarded against it. And even taking, one sign is one sign perhaps, but there were groups of people chanting for this shop to be immediately closed down, to effectively deny this man his livelihood, and on the basis of summary justice. That's what's being called for. Yeah, I mean, there was one community leader that we keep referencing in this, but he didn't want people to be violent, but he said hit them in the pocket, etc. The curious pronoun them is always a little bit iffy in some of these kind of cases as well. What does that mean? But more broadly, he doesn't know the full details of this, and yet was willing to encourage people to close down a business, either temporarily or ongoing, based on a story where he did not have the full details. I mean, look, as I say, that stretch of Peckham has always been populated by black communities, by Asian communities, and the black community has always used these particular cosmetic shops. I mean, I think that they are the predominant customer base for that particular shop. They primarily cater to black women. So the idea that they are in antagonism to one another is a tragic thing for that community to adopt. And it's come from those groups who wanting to sow racial division in the name of identity politics, wanting to encourage particular groups that they are more of a victim than another, more at the, more under the boot of prejudice than another. And the fact is, it's a bit of a cheesy cliche to say this, but working class people in Peckham have a lot more in common with one another than they do that divides them. I think we should all remember that.
Indeed. Let's move on to another story here. Tony Blair. We all remember Tony Blair, of course, very successful Prime Minister. Yes,
he won't let us forget.
He won't let us forget. He's got a curious habit of just sort of popping up, like he's sort of a whack-a-mole character, isn't he? That just when you think, oh, he's gone away now, he's gone very quiet as our Tony, he's not saying very much, and up he pops again. And this time he's opining on obesity and taxation on food. He said he would hike the UK sugar taxes, impose tougher regulations on the food industry in a bid to tackle the obesity crisis. I suggested at the beginning, just keep listening to Tony Blair on loop. It'll put you off your dinner, so it might well have the effect that he's desiring. Maybe that's a way to do it. But he's speaking to the Times Health Commission on this, so he was asked the question and he answered it, fair enough. But firstly, I'm not sure he's absolutely right in trying to succeed via that mechanism. But I wonder how much Keir Starmer needs Blair pitching up with any kind of policy announcement.
Well, Keir Starmer seems to take any opportunity to be photographed alongside Tony Blair, to take Tony Blair's ideas, to effectively model himself on Tony Blair. And I think, I don't think Keir Starmer would be embarrassed to say that he is borrowing a lot of the New Labour project. There is very few new ideas within the Labour Party, and they're taking an awful lot from New Labour and from Tony Blair. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is immediately adopted as a Labour policy. I mean, we should remember also that a sugar tax is hardly a new idea. We already have a sugar tax.
It already exists.
Exactly. The soft drinks levy, which was introduced, I think, earlier this year or last year, and already places significant taxes on soft drinks and high sugar products. So it's nothing new. And you're right, he is the ghost at the feast. He is Banquo at the table. He is haunting contemporary politics in a very unwelcome way, and regurgitating ideas that, one, have already been adopted and have no real impact on the issue at hand.
Is it like sort of, you know, if you remember David Brent in The Office, who couldn't really leave? He kept turning up, didn't he?
Yeah,
because he
said, "I want to go for a drink with me."
Yeah, it's all of that. Is that what Tony's doing here, do you think?
I think there's a bit of that.
He can't quite leave it alone.
Yeah, and he keeps recruiting sort of world leaders to come and work at this institute, the Tony Blair Institute, which sounds like...
Even that sounds awful.
It sounds like a James Bond villain's lair, doesn't it? The Tony Blair Institute, where I'm sure it's not as... I'm sure it's not that.
You just have an image of people, big security guards outside this sort of headquarters that look like something like Apple have.
Exactly right, yeah. And they seem to just be coming up with... They seem to want to control political debate from behind the scenes, control political parties from behind the scenes, and intervene in quite unhelpful ways. I mean, I think in general, politics is veering back towards that kind of centrist agenda of the mid-90s. You know, both parties seem to want to get back to that in some weird way. Yes. They want the kind of chaos of recent years to settle down. And Tony Blair perhaps reminds them of an era of what they might call competence. You know, the idea that the adults are in the room and everything is closely managed. The problem is they can't really go back to 1997. They can't relive the discussions of the past. So that's perhaps why Blair does still seem like a bit of a creature from another era and doesn't really come up with ideas that help us in the here and now.
I mean, up until the point that he went mad and decided to invade the Middle East. Prior to that, of course, and we must remember, in fairness to Blair, he did win an election after the Iraq invasion. But even if people... I mean, you know, he's the guy that got Tories on board. Back in '97, there were Tories that said, look, I would never normally vote, but this bloke doesn't look like Michael Foot. He doesn't look like a mad socialist. Maybe we'll give him a go. And it was kind of... It was mostly quite non-controversial. You know, it did look like... and it chimed with many, many years of a Conservative government. You know, they looked grey and tired, and some of them were awaiting trial and God knows what else. You know, Blur and Oasis were on the scene. It was Britpop, and it looked like a new era for a bit. Yeah. And it could not be more different now, the image we have of Tony Blair.
Yeah, in some sense, we're still, especially in the criminal justice context, still living through Blair's legacy, because he was the Home Secretary that said tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. Yeah. And that was a big part of that. Yeah, Shadow Home Secretary at the time, yeah. He was the one who effectively initiated that electoral land grab from the Tories by appearing to come down hard in law and order. And his government introduced over 3,000 new criminal offences to the statute book. They were big pioneers of the anti-social behaviour agenda that led to things like ASBOs. And we still have comparable powers on our statute books today. Yes. So all of those criminal offences are still with us. The kind of introduction of the criminal law into new spheres of everyday life, I think that we still have Tony Blair to thank for that. I mean, I don't think it's a good legacy necessarily, but we are still living through his influence.
Yeah, very much.
He did change the criminal law in quite substantial ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the last Conservative Home Secretary, I think, was Michael Howard, and he was seen as a bit of a kind of right-winger and a bit tough. And then, curiously, David Blunkett comes in as Home Secretary. He made Michael Howard look like a mad Marxist. I mean, he really wasn't... I thought, wow, this is really interesting. I mean, talk about, you know, giving it large, if you like, in the prisoner department. Blunkett was having none of it. He was a proper tough one.
Yeah, well, every time I talk about a criminal justice issue, it seems to go back to a change that New Labour made. So, for example, the dropping of double jeopardy, which was used to eventually convict the killers of Stephen Lawrence, that was a New Labour reform. Yep. Reams of stuff around. I think that they are to blame, in my view, for a lot of the criminal laws which crack down on free speech. So a lot of the anti-harassment law, a lot of the hateful communications laws, those sorts of things, all come from New Labour-based reforms. Wow. So when it comes to criminal justice, you see New Labour everywhere. Yeah. And actually, the contemporary Tories have been largely a continuation of their project.